University of Delaware has a new poll out. Guess who's the most popular Republican in the state? And where is Camor's going? This is the Delaware Way. Welcome back to the Delaware Way. I'm Larry Menti. It's election year, as you may have heard, and there's some big races in Delaware as well. Paul Brewer is the research director at the University of Delaware Center of Political Communication, and he also runs the polls there, and you had some polls out recently. I guess there's really no surprise when you do the races in Delaware that Democrats do well, because the registration shows you that Democrats would do well.
Yeah, if you look at the registration levels, if you look at the results of recent elections, Delaware's a pretty solid blue state. And you see that result reflected in what our poll found on the presidential race, and on the race for the governorship, and on the race for Delaware's lone congressional seat.
Since you brought it up first, and since it's top of mind for everybody, you can't get away from it. As a matter of fact, I think it's an FCC requirement that we mention Donald Trump's name in every show. How is Donald Trump doing in Delaware?
Let's start with the Donald then. So Donald Trump is not doing so well in Delaware. So in our poll, he was down against Hillary Clinton by 21 points. Now bear in mind, this was before the tape that came out with the infamous comments, and also before the second presidential debate. So there could be some movement between our poll and now. Probably based on national polls, that movement would not help Donald Trump. If anything, you'd expect him to be a little bit further behind in Delaware.
You can't get much worse than 21% down. I think that you can safely say that Delaware's not a battleground state.
Delaware's not a battleground state, and you're not going to see a lot of state resources here. Although I will mention, in our poll, Trump was up in one part of the state, and that's Sussex County. So he had around a 10-point lead there.
And Sussex County does lean Republican, right?
Yeah, so that's the Republican stronghold in Delaware, and if Republicans in Delaware want to win, they need to rack up big victories in Sussex County.
Of the statewide races, the gubernatorial race, the congressional race, is there anything that's close?
It's only a matter of degree. You know, the one that you could argue has the most room for something to happen would be the congressional race, and that's just because the Democratic candidate, Lisa Blunt Rochester, isn't as well known. So, this is her first statewide race. She was still 20 points ahead of Regal, but she wasn't above the 50% bar like Carney was in the gubernatorial race and like Clinton was in the presidential race. She was still 20 points ahead of Regal, but there were more undecideds there as well, around 18%. And I think that probably reflects the fact that Blunt Rochester and Regal aren't as well known as, say, Carney or Clinton and Trump.
And the gubernatorial race between John Carney and Colin Bonini, the gap there is how much?
The gap there is 32 points. And so that's just a tough challenge for Colin Bonini, because Carney, we did polling on his favorability as well, and 59% of Delawareans have a favorable view of Carney. So he's a very well-known, very well-liked fixture of state politics. And so anyone who takes him on, has a pretty big mountain to climb. And one of the eye-popping...
Because he's been congressman. I mean, that's what we should point out, that he's already been serving.
Yes, and before that I believe he was state treasurer. So he's been around a while. And so we found that Carney was actually pulling 26% of Republicans in that race. So that's a tough situation there.
The other part of the poll is interesting, because you were polling favorability among state office holders, and it seems like Delaware loves their state office holders.
Yeah, if you look at the national political scene, if you look at that second presidential debate, for example, and you might say, oh, U.S. politics is on fire, and it's very nasty, and everybody's upset. If you look at some national numbers, like ratings of Congress are as low as they've ever been. But Delawareans like their statewide elected officials. So Carper had over 60% favorable rating.
That was the highest, right?
That was the highest.
He is the favorite son here.
He is the favorite son, and he'll be making a decision about whether he runs for re-election. If he does, he'll start off in a very good position. But Markell, the governor, was pretty close to him, and Carney and Coons followed not far behind. All of them are well above a majority of Delawareans having favorable opinions of them.
They're all Democrats, and they are all in a heavily Democratic state. So some of that is to be expected. Also, there's not as much TV coverage in Delaware as in other states, and that really does help too. And there's not as many contentious elections, which means there's no negative ads, and that also helps. But there is a Republican in the mix. Ken Simpler, how did he do?
Yeah, so this is the first time we asked about Ken Simpler. Now, it's kind of glass half full, glass half empty for him. On the one hand, more than half the people we polled, around 55%, didn't rate him, which means probably that they just didn't know who he was. But of those who did rate him, he was much more likely to get a favorable rating than an unfavorable rating by about a 3-to-1 margin. So if Delawareans do know who he is, they tend to like him. It's just that right now not that many know who he is.
I would imagine that going into this, none of this surprised you when you got these results. Was there anything that jumped out to you that thought, oh, that's interesting?
Well, I guess one thing surprised me a little bit, and maybe this has changed, is that if you just look at white Delawareans, then Donald Trump was running even with Hillary Clinton. So it's, and that's not a huge shock, but if it's the huge margins that Hillary Clinton is running up among African American and Hispanic Delawareans that really give her that big edge. We found about 90% of African Americans that we polled said they would vote for Hillary Clinton. 1% said they'd vote for Donald Trump.
Well, it's interesting because before the tape, everything has to be before and after the tape, but before the tape across the country, he was winning among white Americans. So that isn't that shocking that it would be tie here considering the Democratic registration. Do you agree?
Yeah, it's not shocking, but it is interesting that that Clinton gets that much of her margin, all of her margin, from African American and Hispanic voters.
Does Trump win Sussex County?
Trump may not win Sussex County anymore, but 10 points, I think the tape hurts him. It's going to maybe flip a coin whether it hurts him that much.
Okay, but the bottom line of all of this, and I guess that anything can happen. I would imagine anything can happen because we have some time to go. But it seems like the races, there's such a disparity. The races are pretty much decided in Delaware.
Well, you need something big to happen, a political earthquake to happen to change these races. So, the votes haven't been cast yet, so never say never. There have been October surprises. We've already seen one, so stuff can happen. But unless there's a major shakeup, it looks like a safe trip to victory for Clinton, for Carney, and for Blunt Rochester.
Which it really is not that big a surprise. And the Blunt Rochester, as we said, would be historic. By the way, congratulations on the polling at the University of Delaware. I think it's a great thing that you're doing, and it's wonderful. What do you have in the works? Anything?
Well, we also asked about some issue questions, which we haven't released yet, but we're also interested in where Delawareans stand on major issues of the day, on things like the Affordable Care Act, on things like legalization of marijuana in Delaware, the death penalty, which has been a big issue in Delaware lately. So we're also going to be talking about and putting out results on where Delawareans stand on the issues that these candidates are campaigning on.
Can you give us a hint?
I'll give you a hint, and this could come up in the gubernatorial race, that legalization of marijuana is quite popular in Delaware.
Isn't it amazing how the tide has turned on that all across the country? But you say quite popular, so then it's not even close?
It's not even close.
Wow. So we'll wait for that. We'll wait for those results. Thank you very much. Thank you, as always, Paul Brewer, Research Director at the University of Delaware Center of Political Communication. Also, he runs the poll there. Boy, there's a lot of movement going on around the state with companies, with businesses. We have a guy who's an expert and talks specifically about where he thinks Chemours is going when the Delaware Way continues.